Let me tell you all a story. This is the legend of the creature known as Old Godzilla. Old Godzilla, he was hopping around Tokyo City like a big playground when suddenly Batman burst from the shade.
Oh!
And he hit Godzilla with a bat grenade. Now, old Godzilla, he got pissed and he began to attack. But he didn't expect to be blocked by Shaq, who proceeded to open up a can of Shaq Fu when Bomb Squad Productions came out of the blue. This is the ultimate bomb squad of Ultimate Movie Night. Hi, I'm your host for this evening, Tim M. Sullivan, and with me I have...
I'm Tanner Richard Kraft.
I'm ace reporter Steve Martin, out on the town having the time of my life with a bunch of my Japanese friends. They're all well within frame, their backs facing the camera.
Many such cases. And we have a special guest coming for his first time on the show. Introduce yourself.
It's me, Grant. I'm not one of the Japanese reporters, but I did have my back to the camera as well. I will turn to face the people, though. Good evening. Fanfare.
All right. Happy to have you on the show. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what
Sure.
you do on the internets?
Oh, God, what don't I do on the internet? No, I'm Grant. I am sometimes podcaster, sometimes writer, poster of awful things. Most folks probably know me from either Blade Licking Thieves, where I review films, much like 1954 Godzilla, with some friends on the couch, and also the Super Senpai podcast and Adventure Tomes podcast. And I also do a little bit of writing for Anime News Network. I do, amongst other things, the weekly One Piece reviews and various whatever live hand grenades I have to jump on to save somebody else from seasonal dreck, you know. Some other light novel adaptation of an isekai monster girl doctor thing. That's not even really the worst one I've done, but you know, so writing and podcasting and posting. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. Quite enjoyed the episodes I've listened to of the Blade Licking Thieves podcast.
Oh, great.
Really enjoyed the episode you guys did on RRR.
Ah, that was a good one.
A lot of interesting stuff in there that I didn't know about, and also was just dying laughing listening to your intense debate over which animals would make the best projectile weapons.
Thank you.
An all-timer discussion.
I have to listen to this later. This sounds incredible.
It's great.
I always like to joke that we are the dream of the 2000s webcomic come alive. It's just three guys on the couch in video game graphic tees. But we are on the couch recording, and we're real-life friends who've been friends for many decades. So it's just fun to have that energy of, you know, three friends watching a movie together on the couch. It's a lot of fun. So I'm glad you enjoy it.
Dudes rock.
We should start recording on the couch, Tim.
No. But also more recently and more relevant to this episode, you guys did a episode on Godzilla -1.
Yeah.
Also very good app.
Thank you.
We also did an episode on Godzilla -1. Also a pretty good app. It's a good movie.
I'll have to check it out and compare.
But anyway, the subject of today's episode, if you couldn't tell by our talks about Godzilla, we are talking about the 1954 Ishiro Honda classic, Gojira, better known as Godzilla. This is a movie that really needs no introduction. Everybody knows who Godzilla is. This is the first movie in a franchise that, as of this recording, is spanning 38 movies, I think. Just celebrated his 70th anniversary. He's a huge figure in pop culture that even beyond those 38 or so movies, you have video games and comic books and cartoons. He's just a huge figure in pop culture, a kaiju-sized figure in pop culture. So I think probably all of us have at least a semi-interesting origin point as to how we discovered the creature known as Godzilla. So our opening question is going to be, what was your introduction to Godzilla? We'll start with Tanner.
Oh boy, okay, the person that probably has the least experience with Godzilla. As far as I can remember, I don't remember not knowing what Godzilla is.
That's fair.
My memory about Godzilla exists basically as long as my memory goes.
It's Godzilla! It looks like Godzilla, but due to international copyright laws, it's not. Still, we should run like it is Godzilla! Though it isn't. Ah!
I feel like Godzilla is just one of those cultural artifacts that has always existed in the minds of man. I'm pretty confident saying all of us were born after Godzilla came out. Grant, I don't know how old you are, but I'm walking less than 70.
Well, I just got done with my first freshman class of college when I saw there was a new film at the Kino Theater.
But
I'll get a load of this Godzilla chap.
my specific introduction to Godzilla, at least as far as it goes, is my childhood best friend. When I say childhood, I mean like the best friend I had when I was 5. You know, the one where you go, oh, I wonder what happened to that kid, and you look him up and you're like, huh, he lives in Denmark now or something.
Yeah.
You know, that guy. Well, when his family was moving out of our apartment complex, they were doing a garage sale, and he had this copy of this movie with this lizard guy on the cover. And I was like, yo, can I have that? And they were like $5. And my mom talked to his mom, and I got the movie. I watched it that night. That movie was Godzilla 1985. I only recently learned that it was Godzilla 1985 because I lost a VHS tape ages ago. And then I just started looking up Godzilla movie posters, and when I saw the 85 poster, I went, that bastard! I recognize him. That's the lizard that blew up the city.
Yeah.
That's my introduction to Godzilla in 1985. Though I also remember watching a cartoon on like late night Disney XD or whatever it was called before it was Disney XD.
Jetix.
Jetix, yeah, I think it was a cartoon based off of the Roland Emmerich movie.
Yes, yeah, the 98.
Yeah, there was one, yeah.
Okay, I remember watching that as a kid, but my memories of that are nothing compared to that of Godzilla 1985. There are specific shots that are forever ingrained in my memory of Godzilla 1985, and funnily enough, it's none of the shots of Godzilla. It's all people standing in rooms talking to each other that for some reason I cannot forget.
Many such cases.
This too is Godzilla.
What are your thoughts on Dr. Pepper, Tanner?
My thoughts on Dr. Pepper? Boy, I love it.
That film famously has a lot of Dr. Pepper product placement. It's very funny.
I do think I remember the Dr. Pepper because my mom was a big Dr. Pepper drinker, and I noticed it in the movie, like, Mom. Like, I just put it in the screen. That's my mom.
Tanya Kraft in Godzilla 85.
It's true. Look it up, liberals. But Godzilla 95 was my introduction. I remember watching the cartoon. But of course, you know, Godzilla was always around when I started getting more into movies as a teenager. I made an effort to try and watch a lot of Godzilla movies, including the original 1954 Godzilla. I remember watching that when I was, I want to say 15, except I should specify, of course, as a 15-year-old that wasn't that well versed in the internet, it was not Gojira 1954. I, in fact, watched the American version, Godzilla King of the Monsters. And what did I think of that movie? Keep watching and maybe you'll be lucky enough to find out, bucko. Back to you, Tim.
Hell yeah, good stuff. I actually have not seen Godzilla 85, but I remember going to a Barnes & Noble recently and seeing a DVD of the cartoon and looking at the back, and there was a quote on there, and you could tell that they were just desperate to find any quote that looked remotely like a compliment. It was just something like, the animation is solid and the pace moves at a quick clip. That was just the whole quote. But yeah, good stuff. Ethan, what's your introduction to Godzilla?
Yeah, that cartoon, interesting. I remember people do kind of think fairly fondly of it, as I recall, though I don't really remember the contents of it whatsoever. So my first exposure to Godzilla was probably a Godzilla 1998 Taco Bell cup that my grandma used to store the water that she'd pour into her iron. So it was always on her ironing board in her sewing room. I remember that very distinctly.
Good.
But
Amazing.
I'm gonna buy one on eBay right now.
but Tanner, what about all your novelty Taco Bell Phantom Menace cups? You don't have enough room for those.
I don't want to play with you anymore, dropping them into the garbage.
But my first time encountering a Godzilla film, I very distinctly remember watching Godzilla vs. Gigan on the Sci-Fi Channel, which is probably why I give that movie a lot more reverence than maybe it deserves in my mind. But I remember getting extremely interested after, of all things, this is kind of roundabout, but I encountered a Toho 3-movie pack at Best Buy that included the Mysterians, Varan, The Unbelievable, and Matango. And I remember being really interested in Matango for some reason, also known as Invasion of the Mushroom People, I believe. And I looked it up when I got home, and I fell down a rabbit hole going to somebody's GeoCities shrine, which I tried in vain to find for this video so I could have a link for images, but it was all on Toho's Movie Monsters, and so I started learning a ton about them. I remember picking up the Crestwood House book on Godzilla. Those are those like orange back monster movie books that would have like a synopsis and then production info. And I remember very distinctly seeing Son of Godzilla and King Kong vs. Godzilla and this like Svengoolie adjacent late night program. My parents knew that I was super into Godzilla, so that Christmas this, I was just drowning in Godzilla riches in terms of like video stuff, which was incredible. I got a 50th anniversary box set that inexplicably included Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and also Godzilla 1998 and Godzilla 2000. They just crammed like whatever movies in those sets back then. It was so weird.
Yeah.
But I also got like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Son of Godzilla, Tokyo SOS, and Final Wars, and like that set me for life. After that point, I rented a few from Best Buy and the library, and I was able to basically see all of them up to that point. And I remember really falling in love with Godzilla. Moving forward, though I remember it took me a weirdly long time to watch this movie specifically, King of the Monsters or otherwise. Like I think I'd basically seen every other Godzilla movie before watching the original, which is a deranged watch order. But I think this one I'm really excited to talk about, even if it isn't Son of Godzilla, the best Godzilla movie objectively.
What a take. we do love Manila, though.
That's right.
We stand Manila in this house. And speaking of standing Manila, Grant, what is your introduction to Godzilla?
Well, similar to Tanner there, it's something that I don't really know if I can pinpoint the moment. At some point in my earliest vague watercolor flashback memories of things and interests where you suddenly gain consciousness, I thought dinosaurs were cool and Godzilla was the biggest dinosaur. So ergo, I thought he was cool for as long as I've been conscious and upright. Even times when I'm not.
All correct.
I know I'm of the vintage where television was a thing one watched, not on one's phone. So watching those early days were just anything that was on, probably something like on TNT or USA. I have memories of those old TNT Monster Vision commercials where they would do Godzilla marathons, but I don't know if that was my first introduction or not. But I have memories of being on the couch at my grandparents' house, watching Godzilla movies, watching Kung Fu movies, and just being like, this is the coolest stuff ever. And at some point in there, I watched the American version of 1954 Godzilla. And it was just yet another Godzilla movie. It didn't matter to me how serious or how silly it was. He's a giant dinosaur. 1 minute he's terrorizing these poor people and he's an analogy for war and man's hubris. Another time he's best friends with Anguirus. All of these things blended together to me. They were all cool and awesome. I didn't care. So I have no idea what my initial exposure was. I do know that I revisited this film in college. I was slightly more aware than I was as a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it more for its filmic qualities, but I still wasn't like, it was late night movie nights and all that kind of stuff. We weren't exactly like, let's get out our suits and write up very keen journalistic takes on these films. It was just like, wow, that was a really good movie. And then revisiting it here recently for this podcast, I've been meaning to revisit it for years and come at it with a more critical eye and take it a little more seriously. So watching it again for this would have been that rewatch.
Hell yeah. Good stuff.
Also, having watched a bunch of the cartoons, including the Hanna-Barbera one with Godzuki.
I'm Godzuki!
There's a Hanna-Barbera cartoon?
Correct.
Yes.
There is. And they have this, it's like these guys on a boat and they have like a little remote control. I remember as a kid thinking it was like a garage door opener that could call Godzilla. And I used to take my mom's garage door opener and pretend that it could call Godzilla, which, in much the same way one would take one's NES little orange light gun and wrap it around your waist to pretend you're Captain N. It was the same space there. And I still do it to this day.
One of these days it's gonna work.
One day.
Gotta keep gambling.
I just want to point out, we mentioned the Hanna-Barbera cartoon on the last time we talked about Godzilla, and you were just as astonished as you are now, Tanner. That's the one
really?
where there is no Godzilla roar, like the iconic roar. He just goes roar, 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 roar.
Thank you, Godzilla.
Isn't he terrific?
It's incredible.
Oh, that one! Yeah. Okay, I remember you telling me about. I'm so sorry.
It's 51st podcast. He just every time it's news to him.
Yeah, next time we do a Godzilla movie, I'm gonna be like, "There's a Hanna-Barbera cartoon."
Coming soon, Shin Godzilla cast. But yeah, good stuff all around. For me, I think the first time I became aware of Godzilla as a concept was when the 1998 Roland Emmerich movie was coming out. As far as I was aware, that was the first Godzilla movie. And I would come to learn there were, in fact, many, many more before that one. That wasn't the first one that I watched, though. I would catch bits and pieces of it on TV later, but the first Godzilla movie that I actually properly watched was the one that came out immediately after that, Godzilla 2000. Godzilla 2000 is a movie that I've revisited twice, I think, as an adult, and, like, it's not a particularly good movie, but I think it's a very charming movie. Like, I always watched that very, very cheesy 2000s dub, and it's just very silly and funny to me. Everybody's so mean in that dub, too. Everybody's just talking shit about each other every sentence.
You promised you'd put me on hard news if I shot Godzilla at Memuro. Now come on!
Didn't you look at these first? These negatives are as blank as your mind.
That dub was where I learned the word bastard. That's a fun fact.
Bastard. You really think you could kill Godzilla?
The CGI in that movie, whenever it comes up, is laughably bad. But, like, I do think the practical stuff, like, I think the suit and the miniature work is actually pretty stellar in that movie. Like, I think it really actually does a pretty effective job of capturing the scale of Godzilla. Like, certainly watching it as a 7-year-old boy on a VHS tape, I was like, that's a big motherfucker right there. And he's just destroying the city. I think that movie did that pretty well. Very charming practical work there. And speaking of charming practical work, let's talk about the movie we're here to talk about today, Godzilla 1954.
仮にこれを大戸島の伝説に従ってゴジラと呼称します。
Let's get right into it. Our thoughts on the original Godzilla. We'll start with Ethan.
Yeah, so it's just about as incredible as everyone says. Wonderful performances, though obviously the standout is the magnetic, exceptionally powerful performance from Akihiko Hirata as Dr. Serizawa. That's the one that always stands out to people, and rightfully so, because it's pretty tremendous. I've been doing a lot of Japanese historiography stuff, so like early Japanese film, and particularly like post-war Japanese film, has been on my mind a lot lately. So I do think it is really impressive how it manages to effectively toe the line between like a warning of man's hubris in its depiction of action and like military enterprise at an impressive scale at a time when they were just able to do that, because this movie came out pretty shortly after the occupation government in Japan, which pretty explicitly banned like depictions of military engagements, but also any kind of suicide pretty much was also off the table. So the ending of this film also would have not been a thing. And I think it's also very good at avoiding that mentality of post-war victimhood for Japan that kind of permeates those films, that kind of separates them from their own actions during the war and that sort of thing. It doesn't directly confront it, but there's a certain air, as opposed to something like -1, which is a little bit more kind of ambivalent on that subject, I suppose. And it's not like something like the 1963 film Atragon or that sort of thing, where it feels like it's trying to transplant Godzilla as like the enemy or allowing Japan to sort of relitigate the Second World War. There's a lot of stuff it doesn't do, but I feel like it's just such a tight balance to get all that in there, especially in something that's so allegorically oriented as Godzilla. But beyond that, that was like the big thing on my mind. But I also just want to stress that the effects here are actually really impressive. And I don't even mean the monster stuff. Like the sheer amount of compositing effects going on, combining really convincing matte paintings and different layers of images to really exaggerate scale. A lot of those are even done in camera, just like with multiple exposures on the same reel of film. Like you just had to line it up pretty much perfectly, because they didn't have like optical printing would have been incredibly expensive at that time and also difficult and not have a ton of precedent. Or even I think like one of the footprints like they all stand around is literally, it's a glass slide ostensibly put over the camera lens, so it's an in-camera composite, which is deranged and really hard to line up and look convincing. Just a lot of really impressive stuff that kind of paved the way for the Japanese effects feature, which sort of existed in like wartime propaganda films, but never to this extent. Like there's some impressive compositing stuff in some of those early films, but nothing quite like this. Nothing so extensive and so like oriented also around extensive miniatures and interaction with live actors in this way, and conveying such a sense of science fiction scale. It's so important and so cool. Sometimes it looks a little silly, and even then, like my profile picture, that's actually still a pretty impressive composite shot. Like you see Godzilla hand puppet mode, but you don't really notice that the tree line below him is just a very nice painting that's been composited on this hill to make it look convincing and continuous. Just really cool stuff. And I think this film doesn't get maybe enough credit for what it's doing with effects. Everyone just wants to poke fun at the word suitmation, I think, on some level. Yeah. But what a tremendous movie. Just a really cool object of post-war filmmaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly on the compositing stuff. Like, I was trying to go through some of the special features on the Criterion Blu-ray earlier, and they had like a whole video that was showing like some of the compositing and like the original photos and the shots that are going into, and like, yeah, that really was very eye-opening, because, you know, you just think of the effects as being the guy in the suit on the miniatures, and your brain doesn't fully realize how much work is going into making this look convincing. It is very impressive. I also do agree that Serizawa is very well played, and they understand the important element of making a cool character, which is that eye patches are cool.
True.
Tanner, what did you think of Godzilla 1954?
Obviously, people like us in here know that Godzilla is, quite frankly, a pretty serious film. A very, I think, emotionally impactful film. Obviously, people like us know that. But when I say people like us, including me, I'm talking about current 26-year-old me, 15-year-old me, watching Godzilla for the first time, knowing nothing more than, Godzilla's just a guy in a fucking suit. Didn't expect for it to hit me like a sucker punch to the chest when I watched it 11 years ago, and 11 years later, rewatching it today with ad breaks peppered periodically because I watched it on the Roku channel, it still hits with a sucker punch to the chest. A lot of what Ethan said I can echo, especially Serizawa. That character is incredibly well acted, and it's an incredible performance. And that ending where, you know, he cuts off his air supply to take the secret of the oxygen destroyed to the grave kind of is like really like, ooh. And then immediately following that with the line from the guy where he says that, like, if we keep developing atomic weapons, Godzilla's just gonna come back. Very powerful.
Yeah.
For me, the obvious thing about this movie is the anti-atomic weapon messaging.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's what anyone could really talk about with this one. But I think, especially considering that this was, you know, 9 years after the bombs fell and 70 years later, it's atomic messaging, I still find just as poignant as and meaningful now as I'm sure it was then. It's an incredibly depressing movie at points, just about how, you know, Godzilla as this symbol of man's hubris. The idea that, you know, we can build, and it doesn't matter. But, you know, instead it's like our hubris, our incessant need for violence and further technological development in warfare has created a creature, and we have done something we can't take back. Similar to how, you know, nuclear testing created Godzilla, it perfectly parallels how, you know, dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that took something out of the bottle that cannot be put back into the bottle.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. And I find that type of messaging to be incredibly powerful. The thing that struck me most, though, obviously it has, you know, anti-atomic weapon messaging, but something that really hit me today, especially finding out that the opening scene of the movie was at least partially inspired by a nuclear test going off really close to some Japanese fishermen, causing an entire batch of fish to be ruined and one of them to later die of radiation sickness, kind of had me think about how I think a lot of the themes of this movie can almost be tied into a very modern message about the climate catastrophe building around us. Right now, mankind's incessant need for growth, creation, and consumption, creating monstrous weather effects that we are unlikely to be able to take back, unlikely to be able to put the genie back in the bottle, so to say. That's something that really struck me today. But, you know, beyond the obvious messaging about the themes, this is also generally a pretty entertaining movie, beyond the emotional sucker punch stuff. Ethan said it best, all the visual effects of Godzilla are pretty spectacular. Godzilla feels very, very real in this movie, especially compared to some of the other Godzilla movies that I do love. I do love most kaiju movies, but there are some very silly ones where Godzilla does not feel that real, but Godzilla feels very real in this movie. And I think it's a testament to the filmmakers, and, you know, they didn't have that much money. They didn't have the resources that the American movie industry had. So what they were able to accomplish on a relatively shoestring budget, I think, is incredibly impressive. And quite frankly, the fact that, to me, it's better than some of the shit that was coming out of America in the same time. Godzilla 1954 is, quite frankly, a perfect movie. It's still one of my favorite Godzilla movies. I'd say it's probably my third favorite after -1 in Shin Godzilla. It's impressive that it, quite frankly, took them 65 years to really match the quality of this one. And I think that's a testament to the quality of this one, that it took them a long fucking time to even get close.
Yeah.
That's pretty much my piece on it. So I'll just throw it back to you, Tim.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, you mentioned that last line where he is talking about if we continue to develop H-bombs, we might form another Godzilla. And, like, obviously we have compared this movie and Godzilla Minus One to Oppenheimer a lot, but I do think, it does carry that same weight as Until Somebody Builds a Bigger Bomb.
Yeah.
Once it's used, nuclear war, perhaps all war, becomes unthinkable.
Until somebody builds a bigger one. ゴジラが最後の一匹だとは思えない。もし水爆実験が続けて行われるとしたら、ゴジラの同類がまた世界のどこかへ現れてくるかもしれない。
Grant, thoughts on Godzilla 54?
I can't stand it. No, I'm kidding. Echoing.
It sucks, and I hate you all for making me talk about it.
It's mid. Ugh. I'm so glad we got Godzuki later from Hanna-Barbera. No.
More like Midzilla.
Godzilla mid one.
So, no, I mean, echoing everything that's already been said, it's obviously a movie I wish wasn't still relevant.
Yeah.
It pains me, right? It's like, God, well, I wish this message had been received. But here we are. Just to add further to what has been said, I guess what really strikes me about this, as someone who is also a tokusatsu enjoyer generally, right? Someone who enjoys the multicolored heroes and they're changing and they're singing belts. It's very interesting to see this again and think about the sort of co-creators here, right? You've got Ishiro Honda and you've got Eiji Tsuburaya, and this is their work together. They do 3 films together and then they sort of split. And you can see the tension, I guess, even here. The sort of twin compulsion of like, we're going to tell this deep story about humanity's ills, the lessons we still need to learn, grim tidings, but also look at this super awesome, super cool guy in a suit, and look at these cool little model boats and little model tanks and little tiny cities. And it's so compelling at face value, but it also can have a deeper meaning. And this has both of them, and you see, I guess, kind of they're spinning out over the next few films, and why you see, Tsuburaya run off to do things like Ultraman, right, which is continuing even to today. But it's very interesting to kind of see them still working together here. And I guess what strikes me is, number one of my co-hosts, my very good friend The Heat on Blade Licking Thieves, often says that the best kaiju fights are at night, and a lot of this film takes place with Godzilla at night. And I can't say that he's always right, but he's definitely not wrong. You've already got the sort of reality of these practical effects. We know it's a guy in a suit, we know they're cardboard buildings, we know they're model tanks, but when you put them in the right lighting, which is to say not very much, like them with sparks and explosions and things, it blurs the line enough that it adds that extra verisimilitude, and it feels very, very real because it's done with such genuine care. But even, some of these practical effects, you can tell, you're like, that doesn't move like a real tank does, and that doesn't crumble like a real building does, but at night you can buy it even more. And I think that's really smart here, especially for that horror aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other element I think that's really critical is, like, special effects are so important, and it's just so interesting that they're very much born out of doing the best that can be done, right? Because we compare it to, obviously, the example here being King Kong, right, 1933, that being a big inspiration, but claymation being very expensive, very time-consuming, so we go with sort of suitmation here as an alternative. But I think the effects are even more compelling and interesting, because, claymation... I love claymation stuff too, but it looks even less real because it's not right. It's that stop motion look. It just doesn't. Yeah. It moves very erratically and strange. And I think there's a reason that we think of giant monsters as, oh, it's like Godzilla, rather than, oh, it's like King Kong. Partly because no wonder this became such a phenomenon. And then thematically throwing in there too, I guess the thing that shocked me this much about watching it again, I knew before, even as a kid, I knew like, oh, this is about bad stuff and nuclear weapons and stuff. And watching it in college, I was like, yeah, no, this is a really good allegory about man's hubris and things, as we've already mentioned. I guess what's so interesting to me on this rewatch is that you have, similar to how a much more modern film would have sort of competing viewpoints on the same topic and not necessarily come to a conclusive answer, right? Because we have Dr. Serizawa and Dr. Yamane both being our sort of stand-ins for scientific knowledge and having very different aims with the beast, right? Serizawa he acknowledges that it's dangerous, but he's like, look, I don't even want to get involved in this. I've created this horrible thing. Science is destructive. And Yamane almost wants to take advantage of it, right? In a sense, he's like, this can be studied. Think of all the things we can, sure, we've done a horrible thing, but maybe we can learn something here, right? Almost in a way, like, I mean, it's not that he doesn't care that people are getting hurt. He does care, but he's like, this is an opportunity, whereas Serizawa is like, there is no opportunity that's worth doing anything more with. And neither of them is necessarily wrong, neither of them is fully selfless or selfish in their actions. It's just very interesting to have these sort of competing scientific views within the very first iteration of the genre, if you will. So I find that really fascinating because obviously this really is Serizawa's story, and he's such a great lead. Again, the sort of issue with, we're trying to tell this compelling story about how awful these events are, but it's impossible to deny that Serizawa is the coolest looking dude who has ever existed. He's got an eye patch and an old-timey dive suit and a super weapon. Like, how can you not be like, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened? I hope we get 1 million of these movies. So the tension there. But it's really, really compelling stuff. And you see all of these, you see this amazing model work, you've got these great thematic elements. We're still pretty early in film as a entertainment genre, so just the sort of spectacle of it all. It's all really compelling and great. Like, no wonder Godzilla has nearly 40 films under his belt, right? Like, no wonder this took off, because wow, this is so great. And it's really, as we're all saying, it's pretty incredible how there's not a whole lot in the genre that is in the same space as this sort of terrifying allegory and hits with quite the same impact. It's pretty impressive. It's wild to be a movie that has sequels in a way, but at the same time, so few of them really measure up in this sense. Now, there's the stupider end of the spectrum, which I also appreciate. And this film doesn't quite go that far, right? But there are other stupider films that do way dumber, incredible things. But in terms of just being this serious story about this horrifying creature that really represents us and what we've done, there's not a lot else that's like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great stuff. In particular, the thing you were talking about with the kaiju fights look the best in the dark. 100% agree. I think Godzilla destroying Tokyo in this movie hits so good because it's dark and like it hides some of the cheaper elements of it, but also I think that coupled with it being black and white just really helps sell the effect more so than a lot of the ones that would come out in the 60s and 70s, where it's just daytime fight in the middle of this desolate mountainscape.
It's noon on Monster Island and you can just see everything, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, great stuff all around. Much like Ethan, this was one that honestly took me a weirdly long time to get around to. I think the first time I actually watched this movie, the original Godzilla, was in 2020, because this was obviously first year of the pandemic, and so that year I was going to the nearest drive-in theater, and they one night did a double feature of the original Godzilla and Rodan. Went to that, and that was very fun. Definitely recommend seeing any Godzilla on a big screen. Specifically this movie, I think, really lends itself well to the big screen experience, especially, I think, drive-in. I think that's the ideal way to watch this movie, is at a drive-in. But it's just a good movie. I've watched it at home several times in the last year or so, and everything you guys are saying rings true. You have the allegory for war and nuclear holocaust, and I think what makes this movie go from being very good to being a masterpiece isn't necessarily the scene of Godzilla destroying Tokyo, but for me it's the scene right after, where we see the aftermath of all of his destruction. We see all of these people being carried away. Like, the bit where the little girl sees her mother being carried off on a stretcher, and she just starts wailing. Like, that's haunting. This is very much a movie that makes you sit with what Godzilla has done. Definitely a lot more so than most other Godzilla movies. Like, I kind of echo Tanner. Like, I think I put Shin slightly above -1 for me. They're both very, very close.
They're neck and neck.
They're very neck and neck. I love them both for very different reasons. I think I put those a little bit above this one, but I do think this first one has some elements in it that work for me a little better than those two movies. Like, something I want to get into, and you kind of touched on this, Graham. There's sort of this, discussion of whether kaiju type stuff can really be qualified as horror. And I don't think most Godzilla movies really qualify as horror for me, but this one I would definitely say is horror. It kind of reminds me of something that a film professor I had once said, where he was talking about what makes a movie qualify as horror, and he brought up how, like, in the original Star Wars, pretty early on, you see a planet getting destroyed in a single blast, which you could argue is one of the most atrocious acts of violence put to film, but we don't call that a horror movie. We call it a kid's movie because it's so far removed that you feel it, but not to the extent that a horror movie that gets up close and personal makes you feel it. And this movie, I think more so than any other Godzilla movie, makes you like feel the impact of what Godzilla's doing. Like, you see people getting obliterated by his atomic breath. Like, you see people getting hit with it, and you see the destruction, you see the aftermath, and it makes you sit with all of that. And I think that makes this movie all the more powerful. And again, even beyond that, like, it's also just a very entertaining movie. The effects are all great, like we've been saying. The characters are solid. Like, I think we can all pretty much agree -1 is like the new gold standard for how to write characters in a Godzilla thing, but this one is probably the closest after that. You got some lovable characters, and you give a shit what happens to them, which is more than I can say for a lot of Godzilla movies.
Especially most of the American ones.
Yeah, a little bit.
I say that as someone who likes them.
I cared about Bryan Cranston's character
right.
for all 15 minutes he was in the film, and then it was like, oh, now it's time to follow the G.I. Joe guy or whatever. Okay, I don't care.
Yeah.
That was Quicksilver, good sir.
Oh, forgive me.
Yeah, like, the Monsterverse is not good at writing the human characters, but you're going to those ones for the monster smashy
Sure,
stuff.
those movies are Millhouse going, when are they going to get to the fireworks factory? It's just that for 2 hours.
Pretty much. Like, how can you not love a movie where Godzilla literally goes Kaioken? It's great. It's great in a different way than this movie is, though. This movie is, it's less fun, but it is very fun when it wants to be, and very serious when it needs to be. But now that we've talked a little bit about that, we're gonna take a quick ad break, and we'll be right back with some more Godzilla content.
We must stop Godzilla before he destroys the city. Oh, what could he want? Unless we find something to appease him, we're doomed!
Cerveza cristal. Cerveza cristal.
Welcome back from that ad break. Time for another ad. You like movies? You like colors? You like canvas containing wall art? We got the product for you. Movie Palette. It's a little palette full of thin lines representing the dominant colors of each frame of a movie. I got one right up there for the film Mandy. Tanner's got one for the film Punch Drunk Love. You can go on to moviepalette.com, get one for any movie you like. They don't have one for Godzilla 1954 because it is black and white. But they do have several other Godzilla movies on there. And if you really want the 54 one and you want those black and white strips, you can pay a little extra, get one custom made. So just go to moviepalette.com, use the promo code SQUAD15 to save 15% on your order. So now, back to the show. Let's get into general discussion. Let's talk about Gojira, the French metal band.
Perfect.
Who else loved it when Mea Culpa played at the Olympics? It was great.
Yeah, God, I do remember that. Yeah.
Was that the Olympics band?
Yeah. I did just want to bring that up because as a metalhead, that was one of the most culturally vindicating moments of my life. I loved it.
Ça ira. Les aristocrates, on les pendra!
Since you mentioned color and Godzilla, I do want to briefly bring up, just for anyone, I feel like it's relatively well known now, but Godzilla, the 1977 Italian re-release of Godzilla King of Monsters, which is colorized with like filters, colored filters, and also includes footage from actual atrocities, like actual death on screen, and also very much illegally used footage from Godzilla Raids Again that was released on 70mm despite the fact that it was basically just blown up 16mm footage. So it looked like trash, with a new score and new sound effects. And it's specifically of the King of the Monsters version because they needed to make a longer version, and they couldn't get the original Japanese one. A really interesting product. I hope we get a version that isn't in Trasho Vision one day, like Mondo Crummy VHS Vision, so we can instead see a Mondo Crummy, but more clear film print.
Yeah, right.
And it's funny you brought up the metal band, because what I have to say is music related. I can't believe I didn't bring this up, and as far as I can tell, I don't think any of us brought this up. Godzilla's theme.
Oh yeah, it fucking rocks.
Oh, yeah.
They nailed that right off the bat, huh?
Yeah, that Akira Ifukube score is just beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah, all of the score is fantastic, and like that's why you see it propping up in like Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1, is because that music is just so good and so iconic.
Yeah, that actually perfectly parlays in the other thing I wrote down specifically for general discussion, which is, hey, the prayer for peace is incredible. I just want to get that out of the way. Just really moving, beautiful sequence.
I meant to mention that during my thoughts. Yeah, I teared up a little bit this last time I watched it. Like, it's so... Again, this movie really makes you sit with everything that's happening in that moment, I think, in particular, is just so fantastic.
Absolutely. The other thing is, I'm 90% sure Ifukube was at least partially inspired by Walt Disney's Fantasia, because in wartime, he was actually one of few people that were working with the wartime government that was able to watch a confiscated version of Fantasia, and was part of a panel to decide if it would be screened or not, and ultimately wasn't, because they thought that the Japanese morale would be hurt by them seeing something that marvelous, like that incredible, that culturally refined in terms of pop art. But Ifukube was famously heavily inspired by the works of Stravinsky, and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is featured prominently in Fantasia, particularly during the sequence that depicts the birth of life on Earth and the dinosaurs. And you hear a flurry of strings during the appearance of the Tyrannosaurus Rex when it's about to do battle with the Stegosaurus. And of course, also, let's consider what two creatures fight in the sequel to Godzilla in Godzilla Raids Again. It's the Ankylosaur, which is Stegosaurus adjacent, and Godzilla. So I like to imagine that Ifukube was bringing that inspiration, because famously he also wasn't able to look at the effect sequences for this film. He had storyboards at best, but Tsuburaya was incredibly hush-hush on the effects for this one, because a lot of the times in the rushes they didn't quite work out and they'd have to do retakes. And he didn't want it getting out that he was making a chromo film because people were using effects stuff that was on the cutting room floor. But just an interesting connection that I'd never really seen pointed out, and I wonder if that is a larger thing in the franchise, and I just think it's interesting.
It's like poetry, they rhyme. So, real quick, a couple of you guys have brought this up. There was an American version made in 1956 called Godzilla King of the Monsters, which features the American insert character reporter Steve Martin. How do we feel about that one, if we've all seen it?
Well, that's the version I was introduced to. I remember it pretty fondly. I think while it does kind of pull the punches a little bit, I do think it's still a pretty effective movie. I also think Raymond Burr is a very good actor. And he does add a little bit to the material, even if I don't know what he adds, makes up for what is subtracted. But the most interesting thing about the 1956 American version is the director of the original Godzilla attributes the Americans version critical reception for changing the minds of Japanese critics when the Americans started to say they liked it. That's what the director says. I don't know how true that actually is in theory, but the director attributes the reception the American version had for at least changing the hearts and minds of some Japanese critics that were really not into the movie.
That's fair.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting object. I recognize that it's from a very particular point in time. I like adaptational kind of translations and dubs, so long as we have the original available, and we have the original available now. And I think it's, for the time, all things considered, relatively elegant in its handling of things. The big thing I want to point out, though, that I think is more interesting is this was reverse imported into Japan, where it was screened with subtitles, which is deeply funny because there are sequences where characters are speaking Japanese and it's being translated, and it's not at all what they are saying. But for the Japanese presentation, it's just a subtitled print, and they only subtitle the English. So when a character's saying, oh, he's saying, it's completely not lining up with what is actually being said, and I have to imagine that confused the hell out of Japanese audiences.
Yeah.
I'm afraid my Japanese is a little rusty.
Dr. Yamane is suggesting to the officials that they question the natives of a small island
Also, the 56 movie is what coined the term King of the Monsters, which is...
Great video game. Neo Geo, let's go.
Like, Toho went, we'll take that, thank you.
See, you know what? Maybe we did contribute something to the Godzilla mythos, right?
Well,
because
if you think about it, Godzilla wouldn't exist without the United States.
No. Oh, no.
That's a standard.
Oh, no.
Oof.
No, yeah, I think the American redub and all that, like, now that we have the original available, right, as a Criterion release, I can feel a certain kind of way about it, which is an interesting, I guess, cultural artifact that, again, agreeing with everything Ethan and Tanner just said, like, it adds something, it also takes away a lot.
Yeah.
Personally, I watch all kinds of films with subtitles, and I would rather just see the original. I don't have to change my mind. However, you know, it was released in the 50s. Maybe they were correct in thinking that the home audience would not respond to a film in Japanese so soon after the Second World War, and due to various other elements in our culture, which are also still with us today. So I hate that it was ever felt to be a necessity. That said, there are a lot of things in this space where dubs actively attempt to remove the essence of the original, stamp it out, make it not even feel like a product that's from its home country anymore. A lot of the 4Kids dubs right, in the turn of the century. This does not feel vindictive and mean-spirited in that sense, so I'm okay with it in that, you know, like it doesn't feel like it's trying to just like rob the original of its essence and completely crush it. Like it's still clearly a Japanese film about things that are relevant to a Japanese audience, so despite all of its changes.
That's about where I'm at. Like it's an interesting cultural artifact. Like I think the way it cuts around undercuts it a little bit, but it still more or less gets the point across. And as far as like hack dubs, so to speak, go, it's one of the more competent ones for sure. With all that said, let's get into our final thoughts. Grant, we'll start with you.
It's a terrific film. It's one of the most important films of the 20th century by basically any metric, whether it's its thematic principles, the special effects work that it utilized and sort of pioneered in some ways, although it's obviously adapting prior effects as well. The fact that it spawned perhaps one of the movie characters in the century in which movies became big. Who's got as many films in his catalog as Godzilla? I mean, nobody, right?
Yeah.
So it's such a landmark film, and it has created this whole other space that is really its own, right? People sometimes call them kaiju films, more often not call them Godzilla films, right?
Yeah.
Big monster films. And that's still the case, and yet they can still wow and impress audiences. They can still be relevant, whether we're talking about sort of the shadow of imperialism or whether Shin Godzilla dealing with the Fukushima disaster. Like Godzilla hasn't changed, and we haven't either. And that what a compelling sort of parallel track we're running. And it all started here in a film that is really, really, really good.
Yeah.
God, what an amazing film.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, Ethan, final thoughts.
Yeah, it's one of the most significant films ever made, perhaps the most significant single monster film ever made. Arguably King Kong, but even then, I don't know. King Kong's politics are bad enough that I'll happily give it to Godzilla, much as I do like that film.
I got news for you. King Kong ain't got shit on me.
It's a grimly realized technical feat and a real massive step forward for an industry that would increasingly center special and visual effects that holds up remarkably well to modern viewings. Much like the eponymous beast on the beach of Odo Island, 1954's Godzilla leaves a colossal footprint on industry and popular culture. Its status is the progenitor of a whole new world of effects feature, presented with clarity and absolute sincerity, most of all, that keep it this really persistent, meaningful work to this day.
Hell yeah. Tanner, final thoughts.
I think the easiest way I can sum up what this all boils down to is that this is the third time we've talked about Godzilla on the show. The last time we talked about it was -1. The first time we talked about it was in our 10th ever episode, which was on the brand new Hollywood movie at the time, Godzilla vs. Kong. And I think it is extremely telling that this movie is 70 years old, and yet it feels infinitely more relevant to the current conversation than the new movie we covered 3 years ago does.
Yeah, a little bit.
70 years old versus 3 years old, and I'd say the 70-year-old movie feels infinitely more relevant, important, and in conversation with the modern times. It's like, you know what the fuck is Godzilla versus Kong about? Punching each other.
It's about dudes
don't get me wrong, is great. That is a great message. I think we should be punching each other more. But no. Godzilla 1954 is a masterpiece. Quite frankly, it is one of the best Godzilla movies. It took them 60 years to match it. What else can we say? It's God fucking Zilla.
God fucking Zilla. Hell yeah. Good stuff all around. My final thoughts. This movie's fantastic. If you still haven't seen it, if you, for some reason, just brush Godzilla aside as some cheesy effects movies from the 50s, you're wrong. Go watch it right now, because it's very good, and very important, and very culturally relevant. It's such a fantastic and deeply important, and also quite fun movie, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it here today. And that's gonna do it for this here episode of Bomb Squad Movie Night. Thank you for tuning in. Grant, thank you for coming on to the show. We appreciated having you on. Do you want to plug some stuff real quick?
Sure. Again, if you want more things where I yell about movies with my friends like this, Blade Licking Thieves podcast is the place to go. It's this similar sort of format, but we're sitting on the couch having a very real conversation together. And, you know, we're old friends who we used to do this all the time, but we just involved a microphone. And there's something special about watching movies with your friends, even in middle age, and yelling about special effects. Also, Super Senpai podcast, where a buddy and I watch tokusatsu stuff and talk about video games and so forth. And then Adventure Tomes, where another friend and I talk about role-playing games and fiction and how to merge the two. And then my writings on Anime News Network for a whole variety of things.
Hell yeah, good stuff. Check out Grant's stuff. He's very fun to listen to, very fun to read. Just very all-around cool guy.
Too kind. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you to the viewers/listeners of this episode. If you're listening on the audio platforms, thanks for listening. Give us a review or a thumbs up. Tell us how we're doing. We appreciate the feedback. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching. Leave a comment below. Let us know. What did you think of Godzilla 1954? What did you think of Godzilla King of the Monsters? What's your favorite Godzilla movie? Do you like the new MonsterVerse movies? Comment below. Let us know. While you're down there, hit the like button if you like the video. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more. Hit the bell icon to get notifications when we upload new stuff. And if you want to support us further, why don't you go on down to our Patreon? We have 2 reward tiers. $5 tier gets you commentary tracks, where we talk as we watch movies. Or if you donate to the $10 tier, you get our commentary tracks and a shout out at the end of our episodes. So many thanks to our donors, Jason Secord and Tanya Kraft. We appreciate your continued patronage. And if you want to be just as cool as they are and get a shout out at the end of the episode, just donate to that $10 tier. We really appreciate it.
James Hong plays 7 different roles in the English dub for this film. James Hong plays 7 different roles in the English dub for this film. James Hong.
Shut the fuck up, Ethan.
In the English dub for this film.
Thank you once again for tuning in. And remember, Godzilla is in all of us. Farewell.
Farewell. James Hong.
Just want to let you guys know, I have placed an eBay bid on a 1998 Godzilla Taco Bell cup.
Let's go.
Oh, it begins.
Now cancel it and give me that era.
I'm gonna give it to you, Ethan.
I don't want the cup. I want my money.
All right. How do I cancel the bid?
I don't care. Go ahead. Get your cup.
Oh, okay.
Woohoo!
Hey, hold on a second, guys. Somebody just bid on a cup that I have on eBay. What a sucker!
Just slid my ticket across the table and I said, "Sorry guys, I gotta see about a girl."